This is one of the few paranormal cases that I've ever come across that have been documented by multiple credible people, including nurses, doctors, psychologists, police, and Department of Child Services workers. In fact, there's actually 800 pages of records outlining what actually happened to this family. This is the story of the Ammons family haunting. Hi, my name's Yasmin and I make videos about topics that are scary, disturbing, or true crime, so if you'd like to, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and we'll get on with the rest of this story. Latoya Ammons was a mother to 3 kids, 7-year-old Jared, 9-year-old Nick, and 12-year-old Amy. And in November of 2011, they finally found the perfect rental property for themselves, plus Latoya's mum, Rosa Campbell, to move into. The property was located on 3860 Caroline Street in Gary, Indiana, and it was in a very quiet residential neighborhood, which was perfect. This is exactly what Latoya was looking for. The house was just big enough for all of them, so it had 3 bedrooms. It had quite a large living room, a kitchen, and even a basement downstairs, and a screened front porch. Plus, it was very affordable. For the first 4 weeks of them moving in, things were pretty uneventful. But by December, it was freezing cold outside with a significant amount of snow that was surrounding the entire property, which is why Latoya and her mother were so confused about the events that were occurring during the middle of winter. Out of nowhere, a huge swarm of flies came to their house, and no one else's house in the neighborhood, just their house. They were sticking to the walls, the windows, the fly screen, just everything was covered in flies. Latoya and Rosa were losing their minds because they were swatting these flies dead, but it was wasted effort because the more they killed, the more they came. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped, and they were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But they had no idea of the horrors that were to follow. Only a few days after the fly incident, everyone in the household could hear this constant banging and crashing that was happening in the basement, especially at nighttime. So the family didn't actually use the basement that much. There was nothing really down there, and there was a door that was always closed between the kitchen and the basement. But it sounded like at nighttime this door would open and close by itself, but there was no way it could do this because it was one of those doors that when you click it closed, you physically have to turn the doorknob to open the door. So when Latoya went to check what this noise was, she could see that the door was left slightly open. So she'd come, close the door, go back to bed, but the same thing would happen, the banging and crashing downstairs, and then she'd come and see that the door was open again. There was no drafts in the house, no windows or doors were open because it was winter, so they weren't going to open anything up really. One time Latoya and Rosa were listening to the banging that was coming from beneath them, and they could hear that this banging sort of transformed into the sound of someone walking up the basement steps with boots on. Once the boot sound would get to the top of the steps, it would stop, which was super creepy. So I guess they just kept brushing this off and didn't tell the children because it would just scare them, even though they could hear the banging and crashing themselves. One of the things that could explain this was the fact that the house was pretty old and it was wooden. So when things were going from day to night time, the temperature changed and the house would creak, or so they thought. Everyone in the house was a little bit unsettled at this point. No one was having a good sleep because there was that banging and crashing that was happening from downstairs, which had no explanation. And Rosa, one night in particular, just couldn't get to sleep. She was tossing and turning, but this banging was just doing her head in. She got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. She entered the hallway, switched on a light in the hallway, and when she got to the living room, she could see that there was a shadow on the other side of the living room. And this shadow looked like a figure. It looked like a person, a man. It was tall and it was dark, but she couldn't really make any part of it out. She actually thought it was Latoya because who else could it be? It wasn't the kids. The kids are tiny. So she switched on the living room light and the shadow was gone. It was completely gone, and she walked to where the shadow was, and on the floor, on the carpet, she could see that there was muddy boot prints that were huge. This was the confirmation that Rosa was looking for. After seeing this, she knew they were in trouble. There was no way those boot prints were made by the children or Latoya. These were big boot prints, like it was a man's shoe. A few weeks went by and the house was finally dead silent. There was no sounds coming out from downstairs, no weird stuff going on in the house. It was just them living a relatively normal life, but a little bit on edge from what had happened previously. Until Amy woke up screaming and yelling for her mum to come and help her. Latoya and Rosa rushed out of their beds and went into Amy's room, and apparently she was full on levitating, unresponsive to both of them, and apparently all they could do was just hold hands and pray for her body to come back down onto the bed. When she did come back down onto the bed, she had no recollection of what had just happened. This really shook up Latoya and Rosa, so much so that they called a clairvoyant and psychic over to the house, who just basically said that the house was riddled with evil spirits, and they said that they had to leave the house because there was at least 200 demons inhabiting it. But Latoya had no means to leave the house. Financially, they were stuck there for the foreseeable future. The clairvoyants really didn't do anything to help them. They just said that, the house has spirits, good luck, see ya. So Latoya approached a few churches explaining the situation about the levitation, the flies, the banging and crashing, but nobody believed her in the first place. They all thought it was a scam. The only piece of advice they could give was to anoint the doors with olive oil crosses and smear it on their kids' hands and feet. But by this point, the kids were also freaking out because they couldn't sleep at all at night. It started to affect their schoolwork because they were so sleep deprived. For the next 3 nights though, everyone in the house had a little bit of peace, and there seemed to be no weirdness going on again, but that was just the beginning of the end. Latoya noticed that her children were starting to develop very strange mannerisms, particularly the 2 young boys. They would break out into these crazy twisted smiles, and they'd have very deep voices and say things that were completely out of character, like they'd say it was time to die and that they were ready for death. And then they'd just snap out of it but not remember any part of it. It was like a trance that they were in. But sometimes it would actually result in really violent fights between the boys, and Rosa and Latoya would have to actually separate them. They also started finding Jared talking to himself. Well, it looked like he was talking to someone in his bedroom, but he was essentially talking to himself quite often, and they were getting quite concerned. By this point, it was April of 2012, and Latoya had just completely had enough. She made an appointment with their family doctor, who knew the family quite well. This was Dr. Jeffrey Onayuku. The purpose of this was so that Latoya could have her own mental health checked and her kids' mental health assessed as well. During this appointment, the doctor really listened to everything Latoya had to say. She explained everything that I just told you about things that happened in their house, and the doctor concluded that they were having hallucinations and delusions about the house being haunted and that there were ghosts in the house. Latoya was desperately trying to explain that there was actually more to it than just that, when all of a sudden her 2 boys broke into those weird trance-like states again, and they started talking in those deep voices and breaking out into an intense fight. This fight was so intense though that one of the kids actually shot over to the wall and knocked his head, and he was knocked unconscious. They couldn't rouse him, so the paramedics were called and he was rushed off to the Methodist Hospital of Gary. When he came to in the hospital, the doctors and nurses would periodically come in and talk to Latoya and basically interview her, just trying to gauge what is actually going on. She explained the whole ghost story thing, and I think this was a massive red flag when she told doctors and nurses that her son's hands and feet needed to be anointed with olive oil to protect him from what just happened. They started to think, Latoya might be causing a bit of psychological harm to these kids, or they might straight up be physically abused in some way. The Department of Child Services, DCS, was called, and at this time Latoya, Rosa, the DCS worker, and a psychologist from the hospital were all in one room when all of a sudden Nick, the 9-year-old boy, held onto his grandmother's hand, and apparently he had that weird sort of expression on his face again, and he just started walking backwards, and he walked straight up the wall, did a flip, and then came back down. Everyone was like, what the heck just happened? How did he even do that? Physically, it's not possible. And the DCS caseworker in particular was extremely disturbed. The child was asked to repeat the trick again, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't even remember doing it. The DCS worker thought that the children were under such extreme psychological stress that they just had to be separated from the house and from their mother. Anytime the word demon was mentioned to these kids, they would just go from acting normal to just super weird and just really standoffish, and it was an indication that they were under immense psychological stress. It was actually so bad for Nick that eventually he was admitted to the psych ward, while the other 2 children were forced to go into foster care. I don't know if this has ever really happened before, apart from in this case, but the hospital staff were so disturbed by what they witnessed that night that they actually called a priest. They called Reverend Michael Magino to request an exorcism. Reverend Magino said that he can't actually perform an exorcism, especially not to a 9-year-old boy, because the Catholic Church would have to approve this first, but he was okay to look into the case a little bit further. After Latoya and Rosa were separated from the kids, they were told to go back to their house with the police and the DCS workers as part of a home investigation to make sure that the kids weren't being abused and that there was nothing suspicious going on in the house. Strange things occurred even during this visit. For example, the police's radio would turn on by itself and then malfunction and go straight to static. They'd turn it off and then it would just turn back on by itself. One of the officers even heard someone speak into their ear saying, "You there?" They even heard the banging and rattling that was happening in the basement and couldn't find any source for the noise. In addition, they were looking at the Venetian blinds in the bedroom, and when they got a little bit closer, they could see that there was actually this layer of oil on the blinds. So thinking that, Latoya put some oil on the blinds to trick everyone, they wiped down the oil and made sure it was completely dry, and they left it for 25 minutes. 25 minutes later, they came back and the oil was there again. It was dripping off the Venetian blinds. And there was no way Latoya could have tampered with the blinds because they were with her the whole time. In addition to this, there was no evidence of abuse or neglect anywhere in the house. The DCS worker and the police both documented that they felt pretty bad in this house. So much so that this particular DCS worker never came back to the house, and she just wanted to be assigned to another case, and she really just couldn't handle what happened at the hospital earlier. So they called a priest, and that was Reverend Michael Magino. When Reverend Magino came to the house, he immediately knew that there was some bad juju going on here. He put a crucifix on Latoya and she started to violently convulse and her eyes rolled to the back of her head. That was enough to convince him that he needed to contact the bishop in order to request an exorcism. He said that it wasn't actually the child that was possessed, it was Latoya. The bishop had actually not granted an exorcism to be done in 22 years, but this was clearly a special case. So Reverend Magino got to work. What he did was he blessed the house first so that he got rid of all the bad spirits, and then he performed his first exorcism on Latoya with the police officers, the DCS workers, and Rosa present as witnesses. Latoya went on to have 2 more exorcisms, and these 2 exorcisms were done at the church. One was in English, and the last one was in June of 2012, and this one was done in Latin. She said that the experience was so severely painful that it was worse than childbirth. She said that this thing was just holding on to her on the inside and just wouldn't let go. But thankfully, the nightmare did seem to end after the 3rd exorcism. Latoya's house was blessed for one final time and she made plans to move out. And by November of that year, her and her kids were reunited again, and she actually said it was the best day of her life. They moved into a demon-free home far away from the Carolina Street rental. This story actually became pretty big local news at the time, and after hearing the possibility that ghosts inhabited this house, Zach Baggins from the TV show Ghost Adventures actually purchased the house for $35,000 in 2014 for the purpose of shooting a documentary, I believe. I'm also not sure why, but the house was demolished after a certain time. And people really didn't like this because they think that this house may have had some sort of portal or something, and that demolishing it has just opened up that portal. So I feel sorry for the neighbors. And that was the story of the Ammons family haunting. If you found that interesting and you'd like to hear more stories like this, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. I post every single week, so I will see you in the next video.